Everything in our economy runs on energy. The computer or phone you're listening to this podcast on, the computer you use for work, the lights we take for granted that will go on when we flip the switch, our stoves, washing machines, refrigerators, we can go on and on about this. But we're also facing a climate crisis, which requires us to transition how we fuel our lives, what kind of energy we use for our economy. And it's, well, complicated because we need to make this transition without disrupting our lives, schools, communities, businesses, without dropping a moment of power to anybody. So how are we doing? Today, we're going to talk about a new report that will tell us how we're doing, actually, in this transition, and a lot more. So grab a pen and notepad or your tablet to take notes and listen up. Welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast. We share stories, insights, tips, and advice from remarkably innovative women working on the front lines of corporate responsibility, energy, sustainability, and climate-related issues, and ESG. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. We talk about innovation, leadership, technologies, and careers, always bringing a new perspective. Find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts, on our website, electricladiespodcast.com, and through my Forbes articles as well. And please pass it on to your friends. And if you like the show, leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find us. If you are at an inflection point yourself, looking for support with your ESG work, especially with all the new regulations coming out, or for your career, please reach out to me on Twitter and let me know we can help you no matter what industry you're in. So global investment in clean energy has hit almost $2 trillion. Almost $2 trillion with a T. That's according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Think about that. That's astonishing. Yet, believe it or not, it's not enough. The trifecta of new U.S. legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act together total about $3 trillion of investment in the U.S. infrastructure and energy. And that's what Dr. Vanessa Chan, the Chief Commercialization Officer of the Department of Energy, told me on this show. And she also said that the goal of that $3 trillion is to catalyze $30 trillion more in private capital to tackle this massive energy transition. So obviously, $2 trillion is not enough. It's a transition that affects every aspect of our economy. So where are we today in this transition, and what do we do next, and what do we need to watch out for? Let's talk to the two of the top authors of this new Energy Outlook report. I'd like you to meet Lisa Jacobson, President of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, or BCSE, and Tara Narayanan, Lead Energy Analyst at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. BCSE is a trade association representing all aspects of the energy sector, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a division of Bloomberg Media that does in-depth, analysis and reporting on the energy sector. Lisa has been on Electric Ladies podcast before, so she may sound familiar. BCSE and BNEF are the brains behind this new report on our energy transition called Sustainable Energy in America 2024 Factbook. So let's dive in. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lisa Jacobson and Tara Narayanan to Electric Ladies Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So, Lisa, I want to start with you. Tell us, why do this report? What's the purpose? And give us an overview of why BCSE produces this report, and also talk about why you partnered with Bloomberg New Energy Finance on the report.
Well, first, Joan, it is just a pleasure to be with you. And I'm so happy to be with an amazing lady, Tara. We worked on this project together this year, and any opportunity to work with fabulous women is like high on my agenda. So thank you for doing the podcast. And, Tara, it's a pleasure to work with you on the project. The Business Council for Sustainable Energy started this project for the reasons that you put out there in your opening, Joan. You really nailed it. I mean, so much is happening in the energy space, things that we wouldn't have anticipated 10, 15 years ago. They're happening very fast. And, Business Council for Sustainable Energy members wanted to understand this transition. We could see the early phases of it. And we wanted a fact-based resource that we could share among our industry counterparts, but also in particular with policymakers and the media, that would not only go into a sector by sector view, but knit it all together and try to make sense of it all. So in many areas of the Factbook, we're looking at, short-term and mid-long-term trends, and they're setting important baselines for us. We can see where we're making a lot of progress, where we're shattering records, and we'll certainly talk about that today. But it also shows where we're struggling, where we're not seeing the growth that we need, or we're not seeing it fast enough. Finally, the thing I like most about the Factbook is it also centers on technology areas that may be small now, but are poised for very significant growth. And we don't have that crystal ball, right? We don't know, okay, this technology, that one, in 20 years, it's going to be really dominant. But we can see the seedlings now, and we can see those foundations. So the Factbook provides really important economic information. It, provides deployment information. It looks at the U.S. energy sector. This is a U.S. focused report. So it looks at U.S. energy broadly, but it also drills down into sectors that may be small today, but are poised for very significant growth. So this is like our go-to resource. When we want to, me too, prepare for a speaking engagement. I look at, someone wants me to talk about transportation. I look at our sustainable transportation sector. I get what I need. I want to look at big picture macro trends. I can look at energy prices, or I can look at, broad changes in the power sector. I can find that information there. So, the reason why we partnered with Bloomberg NEF, it actually came from a board planning meeting. We had Bloomberg NEF come and speak to us over 12 years ago at one of our board meetings. And we all looked around the table and said, there really is not an analytic resource that has up-to-date market information that looks at sustainable energy and sustainable energy comprehensively. And that's really how the Factbook was born. Bloomberg NEF, it's a partnership. We learn from them. I feel that they learn from industry, but they are the independent author of this really important resource.
I love that. I love that. And multiple heads are better than one, right? You said something though that before I jump to Tara, I want to ask you about a little bit. And it's funny, you said small technologies that it might be poised for growth that we see seedlings of now. I was at a big climate summit this morning at the Washington Post, and one of the points that was made was 10 years ago, people said, oh, solar and wind will never be cost competitive. And now they're more than cost competitive, right? So you never really know. I mean, what are the small technologies that come to mind, like as you say that you think maybe we should keep an eye on?
Definitely. I mean, there are many, and every year it changes a little bit. But I mean, one of the stories of this year's Factbook, which, big picture, it was really the resilience of the energy transition. Maybe not resilient as it had been in past years due to COVID, but certainly macroeconomic issues created headwinds for a lot of growth in many clean energy sectors, things like high interest rates or supply chain disruptions, or maybe some of the lingering business conditions from rebounding from the COVID pandemic. But across the board, we saw growth, but we saw them in areas that were, as Tara would say, quite nascent for many years. Things like carbon capture and storage, even to some degree, even though there's a lot of headlines about hydrogen, we weren't seeing a lot of hydrogen deployment and purchases of electrolyzers or production of hydrogen. And we saw a dramatic jump in the last year. So and we want to talk to you about why, but there are things like that. But I would also point to a lot of energy efficiency and demand side technologies. I mean, those are critical for the energy transition, especially if we're going to increasingly electrify transportation and do more with digitalization, we really need to be looking at the demand side as much as we do the supply side. So there's so much grid innovation where we can get efficiency. There's really this whole movement to a systems approach versus a technology or individual service approach. So we're looking at those optimization technologies and digital technologies that people may not be looking at as much right now.
Love it, love it, love it.
Yeah.
We'll get into a little bit of that. So Tara, pick up where I'd like you to respond to what Lisa said, but I also noticed in the report that clean energy manufacturing has really accelerated a lot, especially with passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that renewables are a larger share of the energy pie running our economy, as I kind of alluded to with my comment about solar and wind. But there still are a lot of headwinds in this transition and competing forces at play. So where would you say we are at on this energy transition? How would you characterize it?
It sounds like there's two parts to that. One is where we are on the manufacturing side, and the other is renewable energy and the energy transition overall. And I feel like it's easier to start with the second one, because when we think of renewable energy, and here we're kind of primarily thinking about renewable power, right? Wind and solar in terms of producing electricity. And they currently are the sort of fastest growing technologies that are being added to the power grid. And every year we get more and more of our electricity from new wind and solar. I think it was about 8%, like non-hydropower wind, clean energy that's primarily coming from wind and solar and geothermal and so on. But actually, if you stack all of that up along with hydropower as well as nuclear, the share of clean electricity, zero CO2 emissions electricity is steadily growing on the grid. A lot of that growth, like I said, is coming from renewables, right? Because nuclear and hydro have been kind of static for quite a while. And the faster they grow, the more of that transition we're likely to see. The second thing is the kind of the first one that you asked about, which is manufacturing, which is not necessarily something that you would have thought of as being a part of the energy transition, at least in the US, for quite a while, because it breaks down to different sectors. So there's a certain amount of wind turbine and that supply chain being manufactured here in the US. Some of those components are really large. It doesn't necessarily make sense to ship them. It makes more sense to make them domestically. But solar, which is the fastest growing sector, and saw like record capacity additions last year, that was really something that we're used to thinking of as something we used to import. Solar panels overwhelmingly are imported from abroad because from Southeast Asia, which is where the US is stuff. And so what we really saw was that because of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed more than a year ago now, the number of announcements to actually build some of these factories to produce the stuff here in the US have dramatically surged. There's about 34 announcements across North America to build factory facilities along the solar supply chain, 34 for batteries. And while the jury is still out on how competitive these would be without subsidies and whether it makes sense to support every single sector equally and how much of these announcements will actually translate, that excitement and enthusiasm is really there.
I bet. So, you said a lot in that. By the way, yeah, wind turbines are bleeping ginormous. I interviewed a woman who had run wind at GE and now was running a center on clean energy innovation at Clemson College. And she said they were building wind turbines, and when they were building their new facility, they actually built it around a turbine blade because they're so big that they didn't know, it's almost like putting the blade down first and then sketching the building around. I mean, it's insane.
They're getting,
these things are unbelievably huge, right?
And only getting bigger, right? Like the bigger they are, the more energy they capture. Let's make them bigger. Yeah.
So what are the gaps in are there any gaps, or what's your take on the Inflation Reduction Act vis-a-vis clean energy manufacturing? You said that it's obviously making a big difference, and I hear that all the time, and folks talked about that today at the Washington Post Climate Summit. But And so and these are, from all sides of the aisle and all aspects of the industry. But what be specific a little bit about where you think the Inflation Act is making the biggest difference, or where maybe there's gaps. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think it's hard to think of this in terms of gaps because because there's a certain amount of intent, and that intent is to ensure that domestic supply chains are stronger, able to meet domestic needs. There's a number of different phrases that are thrown around. So that's the intent. But there's also the global picture and the backdrop, which is how the US, as a producer of technology or as a buyer of technology, stands in the global landscape. A really good example is sort of batteries versus solar, the solar supply chain, and a lot of the announcements that came through through to the end of December 2023 are in these two spaces. The battery manufacturing supply chain is more nascent globally, whereas when you think of solar globally, there's a lot of installed capacity for factories that can produce, the cells and the wafers and the ingots and the modules and so on. A large chunk of that overcapacity is in China, but because the US does not necessarily buy from China, we buy from Southeast Asia. There's a number of facilities there as well. And so when thinking in terms of competitiveness, our I think it's just something to think about, because if the US is really determined to have a domestic supply chain that is completely insulated from costs globally, it's possible to subsidize that and to say, we want this, and that's the cost that we're willing to pay. And if we want it, we will ensure that it happens. But at some point, we could also ask, are we necessarily going to have the best technology in every sector, or is it going to be that we will build something that's really expensive while costs will fall everywhere else in the world, and we will simply not be able to access it because we built all of this stuff here? And costs are constantly changing. There's a lot of like underlying commodity prices and stuff that move. So yeah, I just want to say the jury's still out, but at least for batteries, because they are so tied to the need for EVs, there's a lot of offtake domestically as well, where a lot of like new EV factories are announced in partnership with cell production, and those are tied together.
Yeah, and that's your point about the push and pull, and where parts might be cheaper elsewhere is part of some of the headwinds I was talking about. Lisa, talk about the energy mix today. Tara referenced that solar is the fastest growing right now. But what percentage, drill into some of where we've gone off of fossil fuels, for example. What percentage is oil and gas? What percentage is coal? Everybody talks about wind and solar, but there's a big mix of clean energy technologies. I mean, you mentioned hydrogen is growing, and carbon capture sequestration. Even sustainable aviation fuel, I saw in your report, was highlighted. So talk about what you found in how you would characterize the energy mix today and some of the key drivers in the transition.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned renewable fuels, because they're essential for the transition. And yes, there's a lot of excellent data in the Factbook this year. We've expanded those sections, and we're expanding them because they're critical when you look at where our emissions are and where we need to improve. I mean, clearly we need to improve everywhere, and we need to do it really fast. But when you look at transportation related emissions in particular, they're now the highest, and they continue to grow. We've made improvements continually in the power sector. So for like the power sector, for example, we're basically 40% or more below 2005 levels right now, which is excellent. Our economy as a whole is around 16% below 2005 levels. But let's talk about where we get our energy from and how that's changed. That's how you phrased it. I think it's really important for everyone to understand. I remember coming into the sector and people would say, this is a 100-year sector. We haven't seen change like this ever. Well, that's only continued to be the case. And 2023 was no different. And, we continue to see renewable energy on the rise, another record-breaking year, not just in terms of its proportion, which we're now at about 23% of our I'm going to talk about electricity for a moment. Our electricity is from renewable electricity. So yes, that's wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, waste to energy, hydropower, of course. I mean, so this is the portfolio here, and its generation mix increase is matched by its output increase. We also broke records in terms of renewable energy output. When you look kind of at other areas, let's talk about nuclear for a moment. We're pretty much steady state nuclear. I think we ended at about 19% of our generation mix from nuclear, and that's largely been the way it's been. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on nuclear right now, so we'll see what happens, especially in particular with advanced nuclear, small modular reactors. Next, let's talk about maybe the biggest change moment of the last decade. It's been the decline in coal generation as part of our fleet. We had like a mini blip during the COVID rebound, but we were pleased to see what we see really is a structural change. Our reliance on coal is now below 20%. And, where is that being met? It's being met by renewables and natural gas. So natural gas, its proportion of electricity generation has continued to increase. So, I mean, there's been a lot of change. Again, in an industry that people would say hasn't changed in 100 years. Well, it's changing fast, and it needs to change faster because we need to decarbonize. And I think there's lessons learned we can take from our experience in the last 20 years in the electricity sector. And as you said, what people are always saying, we can't change, and we can't rely on new technology, or it's not going to be deliverable, or it's going to impact reliability. But as we plan, we can make sure with a portfolio that we can meet our electricity needs and our energy needs affordably and sustainably. Is not a trade-off. And when we match supply side with demand side, we can do even more. And again, we're talking now about the electricity generation mix, but we need to be thinking about dramatically scaling up our demand side solutions. But I'd like to see if Tara has anything she wants to add, because I talk mostly about electricity, but she may want to talk about primary energy consumption or anything else related to that she thinks is important.
Actually, I was going to add one point on electricity, because I think there's a point where it just becomes easier to talk about one sector at a time. But to the point that you made about coal, the thing that was interesting this time, because we looked back historically at what power plant owners thought would be operating in terms of the coal fleet going back the last 5 years. And every year, what essentially happens is they look at the economics, they look at the market, and more of them also look at regulations to cut down emissions or waste produced from plants, essentially say, okay, we're going to retire more and more facilities. So every year, that number for how much coal is going to be operating in the future steadily actually goes down. But yeah, to Lisa's point on like primary energy consumption, we're also sort of consuming less energy across the board, not just in power, but also, if you add up like transport and industry and all of these sectors, which is a good thing, because it means, and because our GDP is steadily rising. So what it means is that we're essentially able to achieve more economic output with less energy. Again, all good things. But when we start looking at the emissions picture, we really need that to sort of ramp up faster.
We need to reduce that a lot faster. Yeah. So on the point of electricity, I want to talk about the grid for a minute, Tara. And, the grid has to, I have great sympathy, I got to say, for the utilities, because they have to transform their business model, their operations with new raw materials, not all of which they know what they are or what they're going to cost or where they're going to come from. Or what kind of talent they might need down the road, right? They know some of it, but not all of it. And they have to do it without dropping a moment of service to anybody, right? I mean, like a restaurant can close for renovations, right? So how are the utilities doing? How are the grids doing? There's obviously not one grid. A lot of people say the grid, but it's not one. How is that all adapting to this energy transition?
I can take a shot, and then maybe Lisa
Go
has some
ahead,
thoughts.
Tara. Yeah.
But I was just going to say that So in the fact that we kind of looked at the grid from the point of view of how it is able to absorb more renewables. And so one of the things that keeps coming up on the renewable side is, hey, we would like to add a lot more capacity, but the permitting and wait times and the infrastructure upgrades, as well as any other procedural stuff that needs to happen to allow us to interconnect into this grid, is taking such a long time. It's stretching out for like minimum 3, sometimes even 7 years, depending on where you are. And that's a big backlog to more renewable capacity additions. Obviously, partially because it's hard to do. Everybody's trying to work on this in order to reduce the permitting backlog. But there are some cases where this is so mired in different like layers of, paperwork and who has authority and so on, that it's actually hard. But there's definitely been some amount of progress made. At least, like, I think a couple of years ago, everyone was talking about how PJM's interconnection queue was so heavily backlogged such that they had to actually close taking in new applications. They went through a whole reform, and people say that's actually moving faster now. But there's also the fact that, like, when people thought it was going to close, they suddenly filed so many applications that it makes the problem seem worse than it is, because there's a bunch of, not exactly speculative, but they're like, hey, the window's closing, throw everything you have in there. So there's definitely something for the grid to work on. But at the same time, there's also this resiliency angle as natural disasters, potentially wildfires, climate related or climate accentuated disasters tend to pile up. That is a cost that the grid or grid operators need to think about in terms of like making the hardware, making the system more resilient against that. Some of them are turning to microgrids, but overall, the idea of needing to spend more money in order to make the grid resilient is one of the hottest topics. No immediate answers, but everyone's thinking about it.
Yeah, the Rajiv Shah spoke today at the summit, and he talked a lot about microgrids, especially in hard to reach areas. Lisa, I want to touch on a bit of a third rail, which is that the U.S., at least for some populations, the U.S. is now the largest oil and gas producer in the world, which might be good for geopolitics, but has a lot of environmentalists and climate resilient fans who have their knickers in a twist. You obviously know Congress backwards, upwards, and sideways. You've testified there, you've worked there, you interface with these people every day. How is the US's role as the largest oil and gas supplier being perceived, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
Well, just given the diversity of our country, and as you kind of laid out, it's going to be viewed differently in different parts of the country. And our energy policy and our energy resources, as you know, are very much determined by geography in our country. So we have very rich geography. We are blessed with many domestic energy resources, and that will shape people's perceptions. Obviously, in the environment and sustainability, certainly for an organization like Business Council for Sustainable Energy, that's front of mind. And as I said before, we don't need to sacrifice the environment or our economic productivity to use more sustainable energy. But for us, it's a portfolio approach. And I really think that's how Congress looks at it. And I think that's how the Biden administration looks at it. Now, in any one decision, they may go in a direction that you think is putting the thumb on the scale. But when you look at things like the Inflation Reduction Act, when you look at the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, you look at the Energy Policy Act of 2020, you look at, going back further at our energy bills, these are really broad-based pieces of legislation that have set the course for our U.S. energy policy. We don't have a national energy strategy, but we do have these signals that tell you once, we kind of intermingle all the different interests, and that be community need, environmental needs, the energy sector and large energy users, we all come together, you can see a picture. And it's a direction toward decarbonization, but it's doing it practically. And it's not about taking one industry off the table. It is about how do we use all of our resources in an optimal way. And so, for example, you talked about sustainable aviation fuel. We talked about hydrogen. I mean, we need to decarbonize. That's the fact. We can look at the emissions, we look where they're coming from. We need to do better. We need to decarbonize. And we increasingly have technologies that are available and cost effective to do so. So, I mean, I think Congress, at the end of the day, when the rhetoric is aside, takes pretty practical, broad-based approaches. That's what gets signed into law, no matter who sits in the presidency and who controls either chamber. It really does balance out. However, I think there are areas that Congress isn't addressing that I think have more bipartisan support than you might see. And I guess I'm hopeful. I mean, so, a lot going on today in DC. I noted that Washington Post event. There was also a Brookings event today that was occurring where they were focused a lot on, carbon policy. And part of the fact that we're just not talking about national carbon policy in the way we should. We're talking about it from a trade agenda. And that's very helpful. But, if you had a snapshot back to 15 years ago at that same discussion, you might have been talking about a lot of bills that addressed carbon pricing in a bipartisan way from a legislative perspective. So, and we don't have that dialogue now, and we very much need it. Not to say that BCSE members know the best way to do carbon pricing. It's an iterative process, but we certainly want that conversation to be robust in Congress. And I'm hopeful that no matter where we find ourselves in a year, that we can add that to the critical top agenda items, because we need to do more in that area.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I've lived in every part of the country, from progressive California to super conservative North Dakota to New York and DC and some places in between. And they have a wealth of energy in each place. I mean, North Dakota has every aspect, has every type of energy, right? And some places in New York State even have every type of energy. And so as you said, we may be, what did you say, 26% renewable, but that's not 100. We still need a 23% renewables for electricity alone. We're still 76% dependent on or 77% dependent on fossil fuels for the rest of it, right? So it's called a transition for a reason. Tara, one of the things that I noticed in the report was that so Lisa's point about we have to decarbonize and we have to control the CO2 emissions. Yeah, I noticed in the report that greenhouse gas emissions are declining, that you found anyway in your research that they are declining. So talk about that for a bit and what it tells us about the transition and the energy sector, what maybe needs to be done next, like what's working.
Yeah, so the thing about the emissions is that we noticed that this, along with a couple of other indicators, was one of the metrics that kind of gave us a sense that like this COVID related sort of blip or the COVID hangover essentially was over and completely behind us, because we had kind of seen that US emissions had sort of steadily been falling. And then in 2020, they dipped pretty dramatically because, of course, if you shut the entire economy down, you're going to cut down on a lot of activity that produces emissions. And so in 2021 and 2, essentially that rebound had resulted in higher emissions year on year. But it was last year that we saw that line essentially sort of curve and start heading back down. One, telling us that the COVID hangover is over, but also that we're kind of back to a trajectory where, year on year, we're seeing this sort of emissions get pushed down. And on a sector by sector basis, we really saw every sector decline slightly, some faster than others, with the exception of transport. And this is still like below pre-COVID levels. A big chunk of it is because of road transport. So gasoline prices are higher, people are driving less, and that means we're emitting less from road transport compared to pre-COVID levels. But we're kind of at the point where we just need to be talking about that number sort of steadily going down year on year. And we need to really work on transportation emissions. Some of the solutions, I guess, of which are more EVs, but also more sustainable aviation fuels, more biofuels, biodiesels, everything across the board.
Yeah, it's funny that I mean, I'm glad you brought up EVs. It happens to be one of my favorite topics. I mean, Lisa may remember I actually worked in electric vehicles at Chrysler, which is how I got catapulted into this space. And one of the things that was interesting in your report is, for everybody talks about EVs going down, less popular, except your report found the opposite, that sales of EVs surged 50% to 1.5 million vehicles. So wouldn't that reduce carbon emissions, and what wouldn't that like fly in the face? You said that every sector had, Tara, you said every sector decreased in CO2 except transportation. Wouldn't that help?
Yeah, for sure. So it should have, but it's possible that, like, at least as far as transportation is concerned, that sort of long recovery since COVID is still ongoing, where people are still driving more compared to the prior year. But but the sector overall is emitting less compared to pre-COVID. And so while every other sector seems to sort of shaken off this, emissions are going up because we're kind of recovering. That message seems to have been shaken off everywhere else. Transportation seems to be the exception. It is true that there's more EVs sold. It is true that people are just driving less, so the amount of like gasoline consumption has gone down, but clearly not fast enough, not happening year
Not
on year.
enough. Yeah. Lisa, one of the other myths is, and I say other because EV sales I mean, yes, there's some OEMs that are cutting back some, but sales have gone up 50%. Are there other myths about the energy transition that you want to debunk?
That's such a good question. I love that question. And I'll give you an answer today, but I want to come back to that, or, I want to hear what Tara's going to say, and she's going to have more time than me. I think we still got to go back to these fundamental questions of, is clean energy reliable, dispatchable, affordable? And you look at all the data in the Factbook, it is. I mean, the economic information on clean energy, is amazing. And it's, we're decades deep in it now, where you're seeing the cost competitiveness of renewable technologies on an unsubsidized basis. I mean, look at the data for the levelized cost of electricity that we have in the Factbook, where we're looking at different technologies, and that's without subsidies. That's without the IRA. Take a look at that. Now, everything went up a little bit, but the cost competitiveness of renewables compared to others is still very clear. Again, let's look at energy productivity, which is kind of like a metric for energy efficiency. I think we've had like a 90% energy productivity gain since 1990, right? So, like, I mean, we can do this. We can grow the economy, and we can use more clean energy. I mean, that is just, we're still talking about that. So, I mean, I think those kind of fundamental questions remain, right? And then as new technologies come on, they get the same question list. It's like, oh, well, okay, maybe it's a fad, or there's talk about electric vehicles, right? That we have another analyst who's very involved in this project, and whenever he presents this and he talks about electric vehicles, he says, I know you all read the headlines. This is like, goes against, you would think this is not the case, but let me tell you, we had a 50% increase in electric vehicle sales in 2023. And so there's still, I think, for my generation, I don't know about what you two would say, but I mean, I think I was probably raised in an environment where our energy policy is kind of cheap energy on demand. You flip the switch and you don't think about it, right? Certainly my adult life, that's completely changed. We need to think about everything from a consumer basis that we encounter, but we especially need to think about our energy. And yes, we want it to be there when we need it, but we need to think a little bit more about what's behind the switch.
I love that. Tara, are there any myths that you want to dispel while you have an opportunity here?
I can't think of any myths, because I feel like we've talked about so many things, and Lisa also mentioned some good ones. But I feel like there's two things that come to mind kind of related to what she said, in terms of just like maybe just a bit of a generation perspective. Because when we talk about some of the emerging stuff that Lisa mentioned at the very beginning, things like carbon capture or green hydrogen, that could be made with renewables and therefore be completely emissions free. I feel like when I talk to people who've been in this space for a while, there's like a certain level of cynicism because they've kind of seen some of these technologies come and go. Carbon capture in particular, there's a certain thought process out there that says this is just a way for people to continue to emit more, for large companies who don't necessarily want to take on any harder steps to decarbonize or consider alternatives. They'll say, oh, we'll just carbon capture it or something. But I feel like given how urgent this entire transition needs to speed up, and the fact that the emission reduction number is not coming down as quickly as it should, we're really at the point where we can't just be sort of sitting around saying, are your intentions good, but can we just simply scale this up as much as possible? And when it comes to how much money are we putting into these different things, if this really is to be the future, then every country every country is spending more and more on the energy transition every year, but it really needs to be like a critical, substantial, focused portion of where money goes. So yeah.
Oh, I love that. And a couple quick things come to mind. One is, I think hydrogen is still kind of a myth. There's a lot of people saying what Lisa referred to earlier of, oh no, we can't do that. That's, useless, whatever, or that's just somebody's pet project. Actually, it's coming online with gangbusters. And it's not just, even before we had the hydrogen hubs that just got $7 billion, they're not even ramped up yet. But there's a lot more going on in hydrogen. I've interviewed a few people about that. The other is on your point, Tara, about carbon capture. I totally agree. We need all of the above, right? We need to just get it however we can. I was in Iceland and toured some of the geothermal plants where they're also doing carbon capture. They're capturing the CO2 before it goes into the air. And these technologies are just extraordinary. And then they take them and they make something else out of them. I mean, I was just met a woman who's making cement out of captured CO2. There's somebody else was making, believe it or not, polyester pants out of captured CO2. I mean, get your brain around that.
I would buy that, for the cause. Yeah, I'd buy that.
So I want to ask you one other thing, and then I like to get Lisa probably remembers, but I like to get career advice particularly for women who are mid-career, whatever that means to you. So Tara, I'll let you think about that for a minute too. But Lisa, what surprised you the most in doing this report, and what should we be watching out for a little more? Maybe some unintended consequences or some nascent technologies that we haven't talked about yet. But talk about what really made you go, wow, really?
Well, what surprised me was, again, this kind of armor that the clean energy transition has, I call it, to a lot of these headwinds. Again, we talked about at the beginning, just high interest rate environment. We still have that. Supply chain disruptions. We still have that. We certainly have, uncertainty geopolitically in the world. So there's a lot going on that might have stalled any forward-looking progress in things that were already accelerating, and also things that were, just beginning to kick off. But, we saw them grow, all of it. So that was exciting and surprising, because I think I was maybe expecting a gloomier picture. But I also wouldn't, I think kind of maybe this is a different way of answering it. I think what I'm looking out for in the next few years, because we are in this critical decade, is the non-public-private partnership investment side that we have in the US. So it goes back to the market reforms. How can we really integrate new technologies into the grid and regional markets if we're not recognizing their full benefits to customers, right? And so that might be the environment, but it might be resilience. It might be, avoided costs for large infrastructure. We don't necessarily have pricing mechanisms in many parts of the country that it really are up to date with the needs of our energy system. And then it goes to what Tara was saying on energy infrastructure at large. I mean, we already knew that we needed to modernize our infrastructure, but we now need to do more with our infrastructure than we've ever had to do. And the vision and the technologies are becoming more real, but we don't have energy infrastructure that can fully adapt. So that worries me, because now we have, with the IRA and, you know, the tax regime that we have, you said we're going to leverage and the grant programs, we're going to leverage significant private capital off of that. And that is fabulous, but that will only be realized if we can actually build and modernize. So,
and if it's adopted, right? And if it's used, you know, you mentioned the market reforms. Obviously, the SEC just came out with their final climate risk disclosure requirements. Do you think that that's going to have an impact on this? Do you think it's gonna because it's gonna, I mean, tons of companies are already doing this, right? The market has been demanding it, as you've pointed out, but it's a push for the laggards, and it's an excuse maybe to invest in some of these technologies. Like, well, there's legal challenges to these rules now, but the writing's on the wall, so I guess we got to get with the program. Do you think that that's going to drive more addressing these issues that you just listed, Lisa?
I do. I think it already has. And even, think about the progress in the power sector based on a variety of factors, but in part, we could say, the whole process of EPA regulating greenhouse gas emissions. We are so unresolved with that, right? And it's, we could do air quality. We could have a conversation about air quality regulations too, but nonetheless, that's moved the market. So the SEC moving on this topic, whether it changes in the future or stalls here and there, the fact that they've done it, I think, is very significant. And around our leadership table, it's taken very seriously.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. And of course, Europe and other parts of the world are doing it anyway. So if you work for the multinational, you don't really have a choice. They've also put a lot of carbon pricing in overseas as well. Tara, do you want to add anything to that of what you're particularly looking for? And we'll let Lisa think about some career advice while we're contemplating. But
yeah, I found one thing very interesting to look at, and that was just the role of natural gas. And I know that we tend to talk a little bit more about power because that's where a lot of the transition has already happened. Lisa mentioned, we're 40% lower than 2005 for power emissions, but it is really the other sectors that are harder to offset emissions from, where the transition is still getting underway. And one of the things that sort of ties all of this together is how much natural gas is embedded in the different end use sectors of the economy, right? Like in buildings, there's not that much of a challenge. Like in the last decade approximately, that consumption number has not shifted by much. It's possibly steadily gone up in terms of consumption in industrial uses, and in power, it's definitely gone up quite a bit, as natural gas also, along with renewables, pushes coal out of the power system. We're also exporting a lot more. I think the US is like the largest LNG producer at the end of 2023 or something. So we're definitely exporting a lot of that as well as consuming it internally. And so different segments of the overall end use economy and just a bit of trade economy are a lot more reliant on natural gas right now. And at some point, that's something that we're going to have to really think seriously about because it does produce emissions all the way through.
Yeah, it does. And it is a fossil fuel, I mean, unless it's derived from renewables. So I could talk to you guys for about 4 hours, but I'll resist the temptation. So I like to close our conversations with career advice for mid-career women. And I normally think about it as women who have 10 plus years of experience, who know what they're good at, who have an education. They want to make a difference. They want to excel in their careers, and they want to make money. So they don't want to have to trade off any of those values. So thinking about however you want to frame mid-career in your own mind for folks, Lisa, why don't you start? What career advice would you give to those women?
Another excellent question. And I could talk to you guys for another 4 hours too. Obviously any day of the week you ask this question, you might get a different response, but I mean, think about your career as a business, right? Like mid-career, you said mid-career, right? So I remember kind of early mid-career for me, I was in a large corporation, and that corporation suddenly had a massive change and shock, and my fellow colleagues and myself were all out of work, very shockingly. And that really hadn't happened because in the way that it happened, and this was a historic, well-known disruption. But when it did, I was kind of like, oh my goodness, what does that mean for me? And it caused me to rethink how I approached my career and think about it as much as what I wanted versus just being a recipient of a profession or a recipient of an opportunity. Try to always have a mindset of kind of what I want first. And I mean, maybe that isn't a new idea, but it really was a different way of approaching the beginning of the middle of my career, as opposed to just looking for jobs, pursuing things that were out there, me saying, what organizations do I want to work with? What kind of responsibilities do I want to have? And maybe I do it through a traditional employee relationship, or maybe I just branch out on my own and just do it. Right. And I feel like women should feel empowered to do that and to be that kind of proactive thinking, and don't be afraid.
I love that. I was just on, I was interviewed by two young ladies in high school yesterday for their school project. And I said that to them in so many words. I said, they were like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get into the school I'm going to apply to, and I'm really nervous. And I said, so what? Life will go on. You'll, pick different types of schools. And I didn't say think about it as a business, although I love that because I'm like commencement addresses, I've talked about being the CEO of your life. But it's true. And especially as the economy shifts and we have this energy transition, there are whole new career paths that open up and whole new industries that get born. I mean, 20 years ago, there wasn't a thriving electric vehicle industry, for example, right? So I love that, to really think about first, what do I want, right? What kind of environment do I want to be in, et cetera. So I think that's perfect. Tara, what career advice would you give to this mid-career lady?
I don't think I think I'm just shy of that 10 years, so I would hesitate to give
That's
advice.
okay.
I'm still
Tell me,
learning.
you have your own experience. You've gone very far in the time that you've been working, so go for it.
I think I'd rather talk about the stuff that I'm still learning, and the stuff that I'm kind of learning by like, oh gosh, I wish I had done this differently like 2 years ago. And I think some of those things are really around asking for things rather than necessarily holding back. And sometimes I think there's a point where there's a certain motivation to not rock a boat, or not to like push yourself forward too much, because you're like, well, here's probably what everyone else around me is thinking, or this is what they want, and so let me do a little bit of extra thinking at my end as to how I can probably fit into somebody else's plans. But maybe that's more overthinking than necessary, and sometimes it might be simpler to just ask for things. Yeah.
Just go for it, right?
Yeah.
I love that. Any final thoughts before I let you ladies get back to your day?
Just thank you. Thanks for doing what you do and giving us an opportunity to talk with you both about, the substance of this Factbook, which I think is important, but also just more generally about women in the field and creating a space for women in the field. It means a lot. It really does, Joan.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Lisa Jacobson of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, and Tara Narayanan of the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So, what do you think about the energy mix that powers our economy? How is the transition affecting your life? Post it to us on Twitter or Threads or LinkedIn, wherever, at Joan Michelson. Send us any questions you have, maybe for Lisa and Tara as well. You may win a 30-minute coaching session with me, and please subscribe to our mailing list to stay abreast of our amazing guests like Lisa and Tara, articles, and career advice. And you can subscribe on our website, electricladiespodcast.com. I'm Joan Michelson. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.